You are live.
Good afternoon. This is the Senate Education Committee on Tuesday, February 4th, 1:30. This afternoon we're taking up a few things, but the first thing we're taking up is a look back and forward, I guess, at PCBs in school, what we've done over the last couple of years, the testing that's gone on. And we have with us Matt Chapman, who I spent the evening with last night down in Pennington for a whole different reason, Director of Waste Management, and Patricia Capolino.
I was also in Bennington with you last night.
You were, of course you were, yes, that's right. Senior Environmental, well, you'll introduce yourselves.
Sure.
But we're going to just take a look at the issue of PCBs in school, not necessarily whether it would be the agenda item in front of us, but just really doing our due diligence and understanding the issues. So I think with that, I guess we should go around for the people in the audience, if nothing else, and introduce ourselves. Starting with
Hi, I'm Nader Hashim from Wyndham County. Good to see you.
Good to see you.
Good afternoon, Dave Weeks, Rutland County.
Seth Baumgart, Bennington District, Senate District.
Terry Williams, Rutland District.
Steve Heffernan, Aston County District.
Floor yours. Introduce yourself.
Sure. I'm Matt Chapman. I'm the Director of the Waste Management and Prevention Division with the Department of Environmental Conservation.
I'm Trish Capolino. I'm the Senior Program Manager for the Contaminated Sites Program within the Waste Management and Prevention Division.
And so if it's okay for the committee, I know there are a couple members that are new. I think we're going to sort of take a step back and give a little bit of an overview, like what PCBs are, why we're concerned about them, sort of where the program started and how we find ourselves, where we find ourselves today, and then
That's exactly what I wanted.
Excellent.
That's perfect.
and then I can sort of talk about the going forward portion. So with that, Trish, I'll turn it.
So I'm going to go over some talking points. A lot of what I'm going to talk about is in the handout that you received, but please ask me for any clarifications if you have them. So polychlorinated biphenyls, PCBs, are human-made.
We can't ever use them. We have two, actually.
State of Vermont PCBs.
They look the same.
Yep.
You got all the same.
Yeah, okay.
One's an update.
They are the same.
What are my, I think are my talking points.
You're all set.
Oh,
So polychlorinated biphenyls, they are human-made chemicals that were commonly used in building materials and electrical equipment that was built or manufactured before 1980. Monsanto is the sole manufacturer of these chemicals. The U.S. Environmental Protection Agency banned the production of these in 1979. PCBs can cause serious health problems. The potential for health effects from PCBs, as with other chemicals, depends on how much, how often, and how long someone is actually exposed to them. But numerous studies, both human and animal, have shown that exposures to PCBs can affect the nervous, immune, reproductive, and endocrine, so your hormone systems. PCBs are also classified as carcinogenic, so that means that exposure to them can cause cancer. High levels of PCBs in the indoor air of schools represents the biggest exposure to students and staff that exists. So if you think about all the other exposures that you can come into, because PCBs exist everywhere, the food you eat, the air you breathe, the milk you drink, the dust you ingest, all of those exposures exist, but the highest exposure to students is going to school. So we are seeing that the highest exposure is actually breathing in PCBs that are being emitted out of the building materials in schools that have PCBs in them. PCB levels in indoor air should be kept as low as possible. And then we are looking at any school that was renovated or built before 1980 has the potential to have PCBs in their building materials.
480, but like what's the window?
So
1950 to 80?
PCBs like 1940s to 1979 is when they were manufactured. The highest production time frame was the late 60s to early 70s, when I think, Monsanto was trying to get as much out the door as they could. So why are we here? What have we done? How did this program start? So if you all recall back to August of 2020, that is when Burlington High School was starting a renovation on their school. They collected soil samples that had PCBs in them. We quickly worked to identify what the sources could be and identified high impacts of PCBs in indoor air. In 2021, Act 74 required that all public and independent recognized schools built or renovated before 1980 be tested for PCBs in indoor air. The original act that passed in 2020 required that all the testing be complete by 2024, and then it was extended to 2025, and now it's at 2027 that requires all schools meet that testing criteria. There are 324 schools in Vermont that were built or renovated before 1980. The Vermont Department of Environmental Conservation, my program, has the authority to require that PCBs that have an exceedance are reduced to health protective levels that were established by the Department of Health. Under Act 179 and 178, we received $13.5 million to address sampling and cleanup of schools throughout the state of Vermont, and $16 million was set aside for Burlington High School. Current sampling have shown that there are 46 schools in the state that have PCBs in indoor air that are above our standards. There is no question that PCBs are toxic chemicals and that they should be reduced. There is no question that this work is time consuming, that it is hard, that it is expensive, but PCBs pose long lasting health risks to students and staff, and the work under this program helps to ensure that we're reducing those exposures. Process of PCB sampling right now, or in what has happened, is that the DEC has hired a consultant to go out to a school. They basically go through every space in the school, from the basement to the attic, to the closets, to the bathrooms, and they look for PCBs that might be in building materials. After that, they go through the school and they group the school into like and unlike spaces. And then they go in and they sample those spaces for PCBs. And so we've required that they sample 30% of the spaces in each group. So if you have a group of 10 rooms that have similar building materials or heating and ventilation or remodeling or paint or whatever it is that the consultant is saying, these are all like spaces, we would sample 30% of those. So group 10, you'd sample 3 of those spaces. The indoor air that we get from that group is used to determine representatively what that group air concentrations are. We've used school action levels that the health department has derived for us, and they are different concentrations for different age groups because it's based on body weight and the amount of food and PCBs that a child or adult would ingest. So 30 nanograms per cubic meter is what we use for a pre-K value. 60 nanograms per cubic meter is what we use for kindergarten to 6th grade. And then 100 is 7th to adult. I will point out nanogram per cubic meter is also a part per trillion. The smaller the number usually means the more toxic the chemical is. The concentration that was in Burlington High School was 6,200 nanograms per meter cubed when we first tested that school.
So what does that translate to for above acceptable limits?
So anything for a school that has a pre-K program in it, 30 is the number that we use. If it's K through 6, then 60 is that number. Okay. And if it's 7 through adult, it's 100 is that number.
Burlington was testing that.
6,200.
Yeah, okay.
And during that, the testing is high. Have we linked that to have any cases linked to illness, to cancer from Burlington since it's been open so long? You know, like definitely like the janitors or somebody that's there constantly. Have they shown any signs of, you know, cancer or anything?
All I can say is that the health department has received phone calls from people who have been exposed to PCBs that are indicative of PCB exposure.
So you had some concern then, people that have been concerned?
I mean, so, you know, we're normally really careful with people's like individual health information. But I
Correct.
think it's safe to say that the health department consults with patients and doctors about medical conditions. And they testified in the House last year that they received inquiries from individuals with health conditions that are consistent with the conditions that you would see with someone who had long-term PCB exposure. So,
So yes.
So, I mean, you know, I think we're always really, really hesitant about drawing the line between exposure and negative health outcomes. That's a really hard thing for us to do, but there is definitely a correlation between their long-term exposure in buildings and similar health outcomes you would see from people with long-term PCB exposure.
Well, and that's been, am I right, that's been established on a macro basis.
Exactly.
And it's just harder to do on a micro.
When you get to an individual trying to look at all of the other things that individual has exposed themselves to during their life and saying, this is the one exposure, but
Correct, but if, you know, Burlington would be a great case study because you have janitors and teachers that have been there a very long time. And yes, the doses are above the regular amount, and yes, we should do something about it. But how quickly, like tearing down the whole student school, ended up costing way more than what everybody thought. And I'm just wondering if there's other ways to handle that type of situation.
Yes.
yes.
Yes, there are. I will.
Before you go, another.
No, I'll pause.
Okay.
Okay, so of the 324 schools that were built or renovated before 1980, we've sampled 156 of them to date. And out of those 156 schools, 102 of them have had detections below whatever the school action level is for that school, either 30, 60, or 100. 46 of them have had concentrations in indoor air above a school action level for their school. And that's about 31% of the schools. And then 20 of them have had a concentration in indoor air that is what we're calling an immediate action level, which is a concentration that's 3 times the school action level. And we're saying these spaces should not be used when the concentrations are that high. We've collected over 5,963 indoor air samples, so we have a lot of data to compare to, which has also helped us understand where a lot of the sources are and how we can try and mitigate or remove them. From the time frame of June 2021 to January 2025, we've had concentrations that have ranged from non-detect up to 3,200 milligrams per meter cubed. So that's not including Burlington. A lot of the work that we've done has included some cleanups in some schools. So we've taken some action where we can to help reduce indoor air impacts where spaces have been restricted for use. We've worked on North Country a lot over the summer, trying to reduce indoor air impacts at that school, where we've done removal of some of the building materials. A lot of the window caulking at that school had high concentrations of PCBs in it, as well as some of the paint. We've worked on removing fireproofing from schools, Twin Valley Elementary School, PCB glazing at a school in Brattleboro, and working on using different types of mitigation like carbon filters, and relocating schools or kids to different classrooms so that they can still continue to learn in class.
Is the Wilmington School, elementary school still, does it have all the collection systems in the gym?
Twin Valley.
Yeah, Twin Valley, yeah.
They are not using the air carbon systems in there right now because it was too loud in that space. But we just finished additional removal of materials in the mezzanine, which is where their air handling system was. And so the issue there was the air handling system was actually pushing PCBs throughout the school from the small space that the PCBs were located in. So
So back in business there?
they're going to turn their air handling system on next week.
Okay.
And I think just maybe to loop back to Senator Heffern's sort of question, I mean, one of the things that we've tried to do is focus on mitigating and sort of like removing material so that we bring down concentrations. I mean, there are lots of different options that schools can take, and they obviously have a role in doing, like, helping to make the choices that they want to make. And Burlington made the choice that they thought the contamination was significant enough that it made sense to sort of get rid of the school. That's not been a similar scenario that we've seen in other schools. We've been able to go in and it's been challenging, but target the PCB containing materials and remove it, and have seen success in getting concentrations down below the standards.
So today, we haven't closed any schools. We are working really hard to balance maintaining low concentrations of PCBs in schools and continuing to make sure students are learning in school. I did include some information on different ways that we've tried to work through that. So in some places, we've reduced the time that students are in school. So maybe looking at, instead of having after-school programming in the school, they have after-school programming outside. But so looking and working with the schools on ways to do that. We've removed some primary spaces in the school. So like Twin Valley, we stopped using the gym for a little while and they went to a different location in town. We've also looked at tents and trailers and helped to make sure that we can continue to have on-campus learning as much as we can. And so what we're doing now is we're working on a group of schools that still have some high concentrations in their spaces to try and work on getting final costs for final cleanup. So not some interim cleanups, but what the cost is to take care of all of the issues that exist there. And at those locations, we're trying to work through those at North Country Union High School, Green Mountain Union High School, SOAR, Bells Falls Union High School, Twin Valley, and Hartford High School. We're hoping to have those final documents and those cost estimates by the summer, and hopefully be able to start implementing some of that work into the fall and into the following year. There are several schools that have continued and elected to do work on their own. Our program is currently paused now due to lack of funding. We're not sampling any new schools. We continue to monitor schools that have impacts to PCBs and indoor air. We're trying to figure out the best way to move forward with some of those schools and reduce the PCBs that exist in there. Some schools have decided to move forward and do the work on their own. To determine that they want to understand what's in their school or take care of the issues that exist.
So just going back last year, we talked about, there was X amount of money, and then they decided to change it. Once you reached a certain level of funding, that the program was the testing was gonna stop. Is that accurate?
Well, so basically we had a limited amount of funding, and I may lead into the approach that we're taking on a going forward basis. But I mean, I think that this is a program that has it's a cost intensive program. You know, I think there's a decision that's been made to really focus on making sure that we address the challenges that have been identified in the schools that have tested before we start opening up additional testing in more schools that need to potentially have work done. So the focus, at least in the short term, is to, or for at least the next fiscal year, is to focus in on schools that have standard exceedances and what we can do to mitigate or remediate those standard exceedances. Starting with the ones at the highest levels, moving to the ones that are sort of above standard in areas where students learn, right? And then move towards, to the extent that there's money left, we may look at additional testing, but I think it's also an acknowledgement, you know, sort of our role in a broader conversation that this legislature is having about how school system is going to look going forward and what sort of capital assets there are going to be out there. You know, we don't want to make investments we don't want to strand investments effectively. We don't want to make investments in schools that, due to decisions that you may be making this year and next year, don't have sort of value. So to some degree, we're finding ourselves in that position where we're looking for the other conversation around school governance and funding to take place to help us understand how this program fits within that broader conversation.
Have you found, other schools with anything like Burlington?
I mean,
North Country.
I think North Country High School in Newport, has very high concentrations that are prevalent, frankly, in larger areas than there were in Burlington High School. And you know, I mean, I think at this point it is safe to say that the issues at North Country have been mitigated. Is that, would you go that far? No, she wouldn't, but we've done a significant amount of work. Concentrations have come down. There's probably there's work yet to be done there. So.
I think it's all state funded, no federal funding.
There is no federal funding.
And then, as you were looking at schools, were there higher targets of saying, like North Country, boy, that was built in that, we should look at these schools first before we start expanding to, was that ever looked at, or how did you decide who got looked at first?
When we put the list together, we sorted it by year of construction. So we looked at where construction and the highest PCB manufacturing was happening. We looked at free and reduced lunch. So we were trying to target spending state money in places where there may not be as much money to go into a school system, and making sure we could try and put our funds there first. We looked at schools that had any construction or renovation plans, so that we could either sample before they were getting ready to do a large construction project or after they were putting in a new HVAC system or something. And so we were trying to work with school construction schedules. And we also looked at if there was a pre-K program in the school to try and address the younger students, since it would be a lower concentration.
Thanks, sir. So your last bullet has, says 56% of schools have started their PCB testing. Is that 56% of the target schools that were built before or renovated before 1980, or the total population of schools?
324 schools. So the total number of schools built or renovated.
So it's 56% of the higher risk schools based on the criteria you established.
Correct.
Okay.
I would say, one thing that we are starting to see is that some of the larger schools where we would potentially expect there to be maybe more commercial industrial purchase of materials might be some of the schools that have some of the higher concentrations. So a lot of our high schools and tech centers seems to be falling into that category for us right now.
And does that bleed, in that PCB, from what I understand, I got a piece of property that we're dealing with that right now. From what I understand, like the caulking and that can actually start bleeding into concrete or making even a bigger pain for the school, whoever's having to deal with it at that point. So.
Correct. PCB will migrate into the surrounding materials. We are seeing that you can have PCBs in caulking that impact indoor air, and the indoor air impacts the paint that is there in contact with the indoor air. And so we're just seeing a transfer of PCB concentrations through different media that way. And you can also see it from the caulking to the building materials that are in contact with the caulking.
Has this building been checked?
Don't go there.
I would share that at Twin Valley, what we saw was there was spray fireproofing on the ceiling, and then that impacted the air, which impacted the concrete, which is the floor and the walls. And so what we had to do is we removed the source, the spray on fireproofing, but then the concrete started to off gas now that source is gone. And so what we did was encapsulate the concrete and then put an air exchange system inside the mezzanine so that their air handler could provide heat and cool air to the school that was free of PCBs.
So, another question?
No, please, go ahead.
No, I don't have any. I was gonna say, nice to see
You're gonna wrap it?
Get through, no,
Oh,
just watching the clock, because I know Matt has more he wants to do.
oh, okay, so, first, comment on Senator Heffernan's, comment. I think that this whole briefing should also be shared with, government operations because of public institutions. It's fair to say it's potential for the same problem exists there, but I know that's not you're in front of the education committee to start schools. But I would be remiss in, because on the campaign trail, people are paying great attention to this, and they kept asking me, and this is not, even though I said this, I asked you this a couple of years ago or last year or something, but you have to at least articulate the difference between Vermont Department of Health and the EPA standards, air standards. You gotta at least address that. So for the sake of the two new members of the committee, that, you know, it's on the table.
EPA has a screening value that they will use to determine if additional work needs to happen. They actually don't regulate indoor air. They don't have the authority to regulate indoor air, and so they just have a value that they say this value is high and you should do more work. They regulate concentrations in building materials. The health department used the same screening criteria that EPA uses to evaluate risk to human health. The only difference that, as far as I know, between the health department value and the EPA value is that the Department of Health looked at a longer exposure time frame. So they looked at a student or a teacher that shows up at school at 7:30 and stays there until 5 o'clock and might go to summer programming versus 6 hours, which is what EPA used in their exposure time frame. And then our health department looks at the younger students in a different way than EPA did. So that is the biggest difference between them.
But there's a threshold difference in terms of the numbers, right?
There is a threshold difference. I don't have like in my head right now, but I think EPA's is 100 to 500 is what they look at, and ours is 30, 60, and 100. But it really is from the health department. It really is exposure time frame. That is the largest difference between EPA's value, where they use a median risk, and we use the upper percentile, the highest exposure potential for students, which is why in some cases we were able to look at reduction of time in a school, and that didn't really impact the time that the students were in school. So does that make sense?
Yes, thank you. So I think the only other thing to add from sort of just again, to step back where we are today and what the going forward look is. So right now, there is $9.5 million that the governor recommended in the budget to do PCB related mitigation work for this next fiscal year, starting in July. Tricia sort of outlined we're doing the planning for that work right now, so that we'll be able to get in and start doing it in July. That funding is not looking to do additional new testing, and that we're trying to figure out, frankly, how the larger policy conversations that are taking place in the legislature affect this program, and frankly, to the extent that it ultimately ends up in a set of capital planning issues for newly formed school districts, that the extent that this folds into master planning or capital planning, that's another option that is theoretically out there that we're having conversations with AOE about how that might look or how that might work.
So how are you choosing, if I'm guessing, that the 9.5 million is some portion of what it would take to do what we know is out there, So I think maybe you've already answered this question. It's those factors, right, that you enunciated earlier.
We're focused on the schools that have IAL exceedances in their classrooms or their spaces right now, and they're either reducing the time that they're spending in those classrooms, or they're not using them at all. And so that's how we prioritize that.
I was thinking about spending the 9.5 though.
Right, which is,
It's closely related, I'm guessing, but so go ahead, so.
go ahead, I mean,
So we're focused on trying to do a cleanup at those schools. If there is additional funding that is left over, we would focus on other schools that have exceedances. They're either using carbon filters or they've moved their students around so that they put sixth graders in the pre-K space and pre-K in the sixth grade space. And we'll focus on trying to reduce those exposures.
Thanks, sir. So just for clarity, the 9.5 million is for mitigation, not for additional testing.
it is not for additional testing. It's to remediate and mitigate the issues.
And that's next year's budget.
Yes.
So we are, with the 6 schools that I mentioned where we want to do the cleanup, we are doing any additional testing that needs to happen right now to fill data gaps. So we hopefully will have a complete cleanup package for those schools. If there's any additional funding left over, it would be identification of sources in other schools that we've already tested.
That you've already tested. What about the 46% of schools that you've identified are in the risk band but not been tested?
They are right now in a holding pattern. Yes. I mean,
Okay, that's fair. I just want to make sure it's very clear.
sure.
And are some of those large schools that we know are?
There are some other high schools and tech centers that have not been sampled yet.
Sorry.
Back to the dose, the EPA dose is so much higher than Vermont's, correct? You said it's between 100 and 150, and we start out at 30 to 60?
So they call it their like ELE, it's their exposure level recommendation. And the biggest difference is exposure duration. And so they use the same numbers to talk about what doses, how much exposure, or how much PCBs someone can have. And the biggest difference is how EPA calculated exposure timeframes. So my understanding is they used 6 hours.
Which
And-
I understood what you said there,
Yeah.
but still, that, why is Vermont so much lower in
The number.
in the dosing? Because, you know, if it's 150 at 8 hours or 6 hours, it's still meaning 150, correct? Or am I just viewing that wrong?
So when you take all of the way they look at their calculations, they'll say you can eat this much dirt, you can ingest this much dust, and you breathe this much air. And so you take all those numbers and they say don't have any exposure over this concentration. And so they end up back calculating stuff, and EPA will say, all right, well, I think students and teachers are in school for 6 hours a day for 5 months. And then they'll say, all right, if you take out what you can't be more than you can be exposed to, they subtract it out and you get this number, 150 or 200 or whatever. And the health department says, well, actually, students and staff are in school a lot longer. They go in for breakfast, they stay for after-school programming, sometimes they even stay after for sports games or whatever, and then they go to summer school at these schools.
So we're talking the worst case scenario. We're taking
They look at the highest risk exposure, and that's what health calculates
and
to.
when Vermont did it, they didn't take, they went strictly with the worst case. They didn't say,
They look at the upper percentile, like who is the most at-risk person in this scenario, and they calculate for that group.
It seems like it would have been smarter to say, hey, you can only spend this many hours and then go home. It save us a lot more in training.
So I will just say, I mean, that's certainly there are schools that have had frankly, site-specific risk assessments, right? Like where the health department works with the school to kind of figure out, well, is it okay for you to reduce the amount of time you're spending in these areas? That's a challenge too, to manage a school that way, right? To have kids in a classroom for only so much time. And that's presented a different set of issues and challenges that schools have to deal with. So, definitely understand. I mean, part of this is methodological, right? Like Vermont has made a choice that we're not going to basically manage risk for the average person. We're going to manage risk for sensitive populations and at-risk populations, right? And that's pretty consistent across all the different types of risk that we manage. So it's both it's a philosophical and policy decision that the Department of Health and DEC have made with respect to how we manage risk and manage people's exposure to hazardous sort of chemicals. So
I remember this a little differently from the testimonies. We've probably had 5, 6 testimonies on the topic over the past couple of years. And given that, some folks are in school playing basketball afterwards, some people in summer school, et cetera, it was like a 10 times it was a very, very sharp difference between EPA standards and Vermont Department of Health standards. And that's what we kept challenging you guys about. But I understand everything you've said, but the difference is dramatic. And that was the takeaway but it was a choice. And everyone's respecting Vermont Department of Health, but it was a choice on, what level for risk mitigation or risk analysis was acceptable.
I think sometimes there was a confusion or a blending of the material standards and the air standards, and sort of everything kind of got put on the table at the same time in a way that the conversation wasn't particularly as clear as it maybe could have been. I mean, we normally and this is complicated. This is sort of the complicated part of the work that we do, right? So, but I think there were a few times I remember we were having a conversation when we were talking about some of the conversation was bringing in things that we're looking at what EPA standards are with building materials and not sort of the indoor air. And again, EPA doesn't really have standards with respect to indoor air, right? But sort of how they look at indoor air related issues. So.
Okay, I'm going to go back to my old notes because I do remember this differently. I remember it boiled down to a choice, not a common a standard that could be referenced based on 6 hours versus 8 hours, 10 hours, whatever the exposure worst case level would be. Because I remember we eventually had you guys put 2 charts next to each other, which was this is Vermont Health Department, this is EPA, and it all boiled down to well, this is our choice, and this is how we're moving forward as a state. I remember that, but to try to equate the 2 standards with just a time frame difference of 2 hours a day or what have you, that's a little disingenuous. And so I'll pause and I'll go back to my notes from last year and the year before just to make sure that we're really talking about the same thing, because the message that got out to constituents was EPA has got a standard. Vermont's got a much more stringent standard.
Right.
And we have to recognize that's where we are based on policy decisions, not based on the fact that the 2 different standards are skewed because of the time of the day or whatever. So I'm not going to challenge you here, but
no, that's okay.
I mean, it's 5, 6 times.
I'm happy. I know that the health department on their website has put in a FAQ on the difference between EPA's values
Good.
and
I'll take a
the
look
health
at that.
values.
That's all.
And we can send it as well. So.
Okay. Further questions? I think we wanted to just get a sense of where we are.
Sure.
Understand the choices. I do hear you about the rationale for holding off more testing, meaning to see where things are gonna end up and where the money is well invested. At that, I know that, my predecessor as chair was of the opinion we should keep testing. For reasons that make total sense.
I think I should add, to be clear, it does make total sense to continue testing. I think you also need to scale. It's about the money that's available to make sure. The last thing you want to do, at least in my opinion, I'll say, is go into a school, test and identify that they have a problem, and then not have the money to basically bring to them to help fix the problem. And so part of this is to make sure that for those schools that we've identified a problem sort of historically, that we are continuing to work to put them in a sort of better place before we start investing money in new schools or additional schools that need to be tested.
Yeah, I understand what's safe and whatnot.
I remember part of the reason why the standard was being questioned was because a lot of people just wanted to stop testing because it was so distracting. And we knew we didn't have enough money and, and I know he takes good notes, so.
Although to be clear, at some point, enough money is a policy choice as well, that we,
Hopefully.
yeah. Yeah. Thank you. Anybody, anything else today? Okay. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
I'm more used to seeing you in the natural resources.
I know.
So they were in Bennington last night because of more PFAS being discovered in more wells.
Oh,
From
Busy.
Yes.
You have all the fun topics.
All the P chemicals, yes.
yeah.
Have a good day. Thank you for your time.
Earlier, but you don't go off.
Yeah, why don't we go off for just a few minutes and we might be able to move to 2:45 closer to 2:30 with any luck.
Yeah.
So for those of you in television land,